right, aloha everyone. We are back with the AM Ukulele podcast, and today we have a special treat for everyone. We have an ukulele historian and a vintage ukulele collector, good friend of mine, Shawn Yacavone. Thanks for joining us, man.
Aloha, aloha, Andrew. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, we've got to have you on because your knowledge of ukuleles and just your collection of ukuleles is like none other. So I'm just curious, like what got you into this unique hobby?
I've always had a connection with the ukulele. More on the historical end, I was always fascinated with the history of the ukulele. I was also fascinated with the construction of the instrument, both the historical construction as well as the contemporary ones. What luthiers of custom ukuleles are doing nowadays as well. And so, I just spent a lot of time just reading and being in the right groups. I was kind of night into the ukulele collectors group, so to speak. So I have a lot of mentors there that kind of walked me through this process over the years. But it just kind of grew out of that. Obviously, I didn't have these instruments that I have now way back when. But it's just fun. The ukulele is just a fun instrument. The history is fascinating, and the coolest thing I think about the ukulele, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but I think one thing that is so neat, what ethnicity or ethnicities are you?
I'm a lot of people get surprised, but I'm actually I'm about quarter kind of like Irish, something in that region, then Japanese, Korean, and Spanish.
Japanese, Korean, and Spanish, right? So very got a mixture of ethnicities there, and for myself, I'm Filipino Italian, two
Oh,
different parts of the world. But I always found that the ukulele is such an interesting instrument to me because we associate the ukulele with being with Hawaii, but at the same time, it has Portuguese origins. At least the parent instruments come from Portugal. Ukulele was created here in Hawaii.
correct.
But I think one thing that's so fascinating to me is that the ukulele really is it's kind of this representation of who we are in Hawaii, in that the ukulele itself is a blend of cultures. It's a blend of Portuguese culture, it's a blend of Hawaii musicians and the Hawaiian culture, and throughout the history here at least, there's a lot to be said about all the different types of ukulele musicians and so forth that elevated the instrument. But the ukulele is a beautiful representation of the people of Hawaii because it's not one singular culture, so to
Yeah.
speak. It's a blend, of all of these cultures that became popular and the instrument carried through. And that's what I really love about the ukulele. I feel a sense of identity with that being, you know, of mixed ethnic race myself, and for you too, I would imagine.
Hey, that's well said. I actually never thought of it like that, but it makes sense. Like with the cultures and then like the types of music. I mean, I guess you could play, and it's just like, come on, who doesn't like ukulele, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And
not,
it's amazing too with new instruments nowadays. I mean, we see ukulele circles and groups and festivals all over the world. And what's kind of cool is that some of those festivals play, music that you wrote, and there are people on YouTube that play music that Jake wrote and others. But there are also a whole bunch of people that are playing folk music from their own cultures in
yeah.
those small areas on the ukulele. And I think that is so wonderful because ukulele is going in so many different directions and is so versatile that it can adapt to all these different types of genres, different types of music, folk music and Hawaiian music and everything else. It's really a beautiful instrument. Yeah.
It is, and I think that's why it's so popular. Is that
Hmm.
it's so flexible. One, of course, you got the size of the ukulele is very friendly, right? It's not
Hmm.
like having to lug a huge cello around and just telling, like asking someone to play it, versus yeah, like a violin or a cello, right? Which is kind of like intimidating the size of the instrument and just looking at it. In ukulele, a regular just a regular customer will go into an ABC store and just strum it just because it's like, oh, it's just
Hmm.
it's ukulele, it's easy. But the thing about the ukulele that's so awesome is that you can play it at different levels. You can play it at a virtuoso level, or you can also just play it to jam with your friends, or you can just strum it to play your first song in an ABC store.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so big appeal. But yeah, so I came to your studio. It's a couple years back, I think in 2018. But Shawn just has this amazing collection of ukuleles that I've never seen before, and it ranges from Chuck Moore ukuleles. You got Eric Devine's in there, Steve Grimes, and it's just I'm just curious. Do you have a favorite like ukulele that you have?
It's funny. People ask me, what's your favorite instrument to play in there? And it's actually a guitar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I have several Kamaka guitars, and some of these early Kamaka guitars are absolutely phenomenal. I guess I look at them a little bit in isolation. I mean, I have some favorites on the historical ukulele side. I mean, there's nothing cooler than saying that this is the earliest known example of an ukulele in existence, and to be able to take that out and play it. So that one is kind of special on its own.
Yeah, the first.
But there's a beautiful parallel between the world of historical ukuleles and contemporary or full custom ukuleles that are being handcrafted today. Both of those instruments, are really custom instruments or fully handcrafted instruments with utilizing different technologies. But the number one thing that's most important is the knowledge of woodworking and the skills behind the build. And you can see that there's consistencies there between the historical pieces and the ones that are being built now. It's very difficult to say, hey, which is your absolute favorite one? But I mean, they're kind of like kids, right? You can kind of, talk about all of the little nuances of each one of those instruments. And then there are also some that sound better in certain genre of music, certain playing style. I mean, you would be able to speak to that more than I would. And I'm looking forward to getting you over in the day.
I know. I can't wait to
it's been
see
a
what
while
else you
since
got.
you visited. So, but it would be great to have you and your dad come by as well. But yeah, there's a lot in there, and the custom ukuleles are quite remarkable. I mean, they're remarkable in the sense that they're very, very sterile. The precision is remarkable on those instruments. The intonation is set perfectly. The scale length is set perfectly. The comfort is great. The feel of the neck is good. I mean, all of the things that you and everyone else talks about and what they would want from a custom instrument, it's all on there, right? The more betters, the Steve Grimes, the Divines, and then there are many, many others that are great, phenomenal builders, but maybe they fly under the radar. But the quality of the workmanship is equally as high. Whereas you look at the vintage instruments, and the vintage instruments, they take on a whole different personality. And the reason is because, I mean, these instruments have been around for 130 to 140 years. And these are the earliest known ukuleles in existence. And what's crazy is sometimes the ukulele will actually tell you, kind of like grandpa, when you go, Kanikapila, right? And grandpa's over there and he's jamming on his music. But some music, grandpa just tells you, I don't play that music, right? That's not me. It's not you, right? So it's almost like there's another person in the room when we take out the vintage instruments, because on certain genre of music, the instrument stretches out and will tell you, oh, this is me. But certain other areas, it's just like, this is not for me, Sonny. I don't play that kind of music.
That's interesting. What genres stood out on the old school instruments?
The old instruments, because a lot of builders talk about building for a specific type of sound. Typically that sound is a reflection of the music of that time period. So if you play on these instruments music, let's just say Kalana Napua as an example, right? That was written, shortly after the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. That type of music on these instruments, the instrument comes alive. Whereas you play something a little more contemporary, it sounds good, but it's not a right match. And the instrument actually tells you that, and it's funny because I know, not being a musician myself, but watching guys like you and Herb that has Herbalta Jr. and Abe Agreemus has come by, and Jake has come by, Brian Tolentino, a whole bunch of the gang, Brittany and everyone else. And it's so neat because I can see a dialogue that's happening between you guys and the instrument. Like you're
Oh,
playing and you're like, oh, and then you change the song or it speaks to you and you kind of make adjustments to that. That's always fascinated me. But these early instruments, if you play period specific music, that's when the personalities are biggest. Yeah.
ooh, that's very fascinating. I have to approach that next time I come to your place
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
that
Or you
was
got to
interesting.
brush up on your early 1900s, late 1800s composition, your work, your music. You got to
Yeah,
pick up on
I'll
the
take a look.
songs.
But I noticed that. I noticed that like even playing some of the more contemporary.
Hmm.
I think it was a Divine. I played it. That was one
Hmm.
of the ones that stuck out. I can't remember the wood. I think it was a cedar, possibly. But I
Hmm.
remember I was just kind of noodling around, and I found out like it complemented like a bossa nova kind of
Hmm.
vibe and that touch and those licks. But versus like classic rock, I was like, I'll say that for another ukulele.
Hmm.
But it's
Hmm.
interesting how like certain ukuleles and from like we said the time period, I never actually thought about that before. So I think that's very fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. And so the same thing's true with the builders nowadays, right? They're building typically for music or a certain sound that reflects this time period. Although, there are also builders that will intentionally build for a certain type of sound that might
Hmm.
be an aged sound or something that's from an earlier time period. I mean, what's fascinating to me, and you've been there several times, but if you go to the NAM show, it's really interesting because, sure, they have all kinds of new guitars and new ukuleles and all new instruments. But if you look really closely, there's a huge market that is trying to emulate a vintage sound. Have you ever noticed that? They will
Yeah,
have all of these technologies to make the instrument sound aged, right? And then they'll approach, with different scientific measures to be able to, do different things to the wood or, alter the sound in different ways.
yeah, like, that's true. Nam has a lot of ukuleles, and one of the ukuleles that I remember seeing, it was Martin, right? I think they tried to do like a Brother Is model,
Mm-hmm.
the
They
mahogany, correct? I've never played that one, so I wouldn't know like how accurate the representation of that was at the like a '90s time period.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think at that point they were doing Martin had, started early on with ukuleles back in actually 1907. They did a short run of about six instruments, but they made them a little too similar to guitars. They were
Mhm.
overbraced. And so they took a step back for about 10 years actually, and then they started up again 1917, and they built all these different models, simplified the bracing. But by the time they got into past World War II and into the more modern times, they actually stopped making certain models at different time periods along the way. The coal ones
Hmm.
faded out earlier because of the war and other reasons to get the coal to Pennsylvania more difficult. And then they kept with mahogany, and eventually they phased out all the ukuleles altogether outside of custom orders. And then shortly thereafter, or maybe 10, 15 years after that, it's when they did a reissue. So the one that you're talking about falls into that latter time period, that
Right.
reissue time period. And yeah, mahogany they brought back, and then they were using other woods too. They brought back koa, they did some cherry wood, some
Oh,
different things.
okay.
But you're right, the sound of that instrument is a bit unique, it's a bit different. But there's also a generation, at least one generation of builders out of Martin, uh, that by which the know-how to build those earlier ukuleles, it missed a generation because all of those builders in between weren't necessarily building ukuleles. So what you have is this gap in between, and then when they restart with the reissue, even though they have all the molds and everything, they're relearning the process of building ukuleles because you have a new generation of builders at the Martin factory.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
whole evolution and generation is just you can kind of hear it and you can see it. Like we were talking about the more contemporary ukuleles, like man, that Chuck Moore with those fretboards, like it's just a sight to see. Like it's
Yeah.
just incredible. And which ones you've had a couple, right?
Yeah, we have a few right now. And one of them, I mean, these are pre-owned pieces, but they're so full, such beautiful sound. Of course, the workmanship and the beauty of the instrument, is its own, it's art, it's
It is.
functional art. But at the same time, the sound of the instruments are fantastic.
Yeah.
And the best builders, Chuck is certainly one of them too. But these people that are at the top of their building careers are their own worst critics.
Mm,
And I say that with nothing but the utmost respect because they really elevate the instruments to another level. I mean, the same thing's true about your instrument, like the one that Joji made, even your custom kamaka and those instruments. It's kamaka is a household name, but and most people that own and play a kamaka, sure, those are wonderful instruments, but the vast majority of people out there have never touched a a KC kamaka ukulele, right? The
right.
vast
Like that
majority of
elite
people,
level.
right? And it's different, right? It's different from the production end. Although the production end is wonderful, they are apples and oranges in that sense. Um, and so guys like you and all the Kamaka musicians that are out there, what we hear being played, um, oftentimes run through a DI, but it's also not entirely the same as what you would walk into a store and listen and pick up and play too. Those are kind of different animals, as you would know. Yeah.
Yeah. For sure. And that's the thing that I love discovering, especially when I attended the ukulele guild,
Hmm.
was that because like pretty much getting into the whole ukulele scene, you got the 3Ks, you got Kamaka, Kanilea, and Koaloa. And then like you said, like a lot of people don't know of these other luthiers who they are
Yeah.
kind of like more independent build, but the
Hmm.
craftsmanship is just crazy. That's why like and that's how I met Joji, and I was like, dang man, I was like, can you build me one? Because I was so
Uh,
impressed by the stuff, and like Grimes, Divine, Chuck Moore. It's just
absolutely.
like, yeah, these independent builders are like some of they're just top notch ukuleles, and it's just
Yeah. And,
whenever
it,
I
and
see
it's such
one.
a, no, go ahead.
I know I was gonna say whenever I see one, I was just like, I gotta play it because it's like kind of that holy grail of ukuleles that you barely see, but it has a lot of mana inside.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's such I consider myself very fortunate and that I'm friends with many of these people and have gotten to know them over the years. And really, they are my teachers, right? I mean, I spent hours and hours and hours on end, either visiting or chatting over the phone or emails, because I'm so curious about the build process and how they get such a remarkable sound out of the instruments that they make. And there's so much for me to learn, and I feel somewhat of an obligation, or maybe I'm just passionate, but I want to share that with others. And that's why I, uh, you know, take time to record them, and then I'm also interested in recording them for other builders. So the platform on Ukulele Friend um, not only has vintage instruments, and there's a museum page where you can listen to some of the first earliest ukuleles ever made, but there's a video section, and I put that in there simply because there are builders all over the world. And I have some friends that are in Switzerland, friends that are in Finland, that are also building ukuleles. Wonderful people. And I try in small ways in creating a platform for builders that are not here in Hawaii, that don't have the benefit, like you and I. We cannot help but go into a store or turn on the radio, and constantly we're surrounded by the sound of ukulele here in Hawaii, and we're very fortunate. But people that don't have access to that and are wondering, what does these historical ukuleles sound like if I want to make something that sounds like that? Or what does a Chuck Moore sound like, or a Divine sound like? That I have kind of repository of all these videos where builders that are not here in Hawaii don't need to fly to Hawaii to hear them. They would be
Mm,
able to just go online and be able to get an idea of what those instruments sound like. And so I'm trying to create a platform where builders can also be supported, and then the general public can also be supported with the history and so forth. But also musicians, and that's why I want you to come in too, because I want musicians to experience. I can't do this with all musicians, but obviously, certain select musicians, we can have them come in and experience these historical or custom ukuleles firsthand.
nice. And yeah, thanks for what you do to give us the opportunity to try all these ukuleles, and for the community just to check it out. Because literally, someone says old ukulele, oh, Sean. he got it. You know, like you're the guy who comes to mind. So yeah, definitely check out Shawn if you're interested in any ukulele history or some of his. Just I remember he has like ukuleles from like the was that the Jake model too. I think you had one of those,
Yeah,
and ranging just from the earliest ukuleles up to the most contemporary crazy ukuleles that they make these days. But yeah, I love what you do, man, and please keep it up.
oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's really those two worlds that I'm most passionate about. And uh, there's a lot to be said about the budget, the entry level budget friendly instruments. As a result of, makers like Lanika and Kala and these others, people who would otherwise not have picked up the instrument now have a budget friendly option.
Yeah,
And it's wonderful, and so but my passion really is in two worlds. It's museum grade historical ukuleles, and then the other end of that is musicians like custom, the top
yeah,
end ukuleles, and then the parallel between those two. That's really the two worlds that I like to hang out in the most.
nice.
The production area, and then not the lower end budget area. Although it's great that we have a full spectrum and everybody can enjoy the ukulele, but my passion is kind of in those two.
I think that speaks for a lot of us ukulele players because we're always fascinated at what you have. Like is it like yeah again is it a new Chuck Moore, is it a Divine, because they're really like on top of their game. But then it's also like you said, the Kamaki guitars. Like I was
Yeah,
actually just sitting with Neil today and we are talking about it.
yeah,
And it's just
yeah.
like
Those guitars are amazing. And remember we talked about building towards a specific sound.
yeah.
Those guitars are kind of smaller body guitars. I mean, um, I have several from the 1960s that are more classical guitars, and then some of the earlier ones from the teens and 20s. But those earlier ones, my goodness, you tune that thing in slack key, and that thing is an animal.
Oh.
Those instruments, they sound fantastic in standard tuning, but in slack key, that is unparalleled.
Oh
My
wow.
little showroom can't is too small. It's too small for what that guitar wants to give out. And I mean, it's kind of like a wild horse, like a stallion. It wants to run. You got to tame that thing. But it is killer. Yeah, and it's fun to hear.
Oh nice.
Yeah,
Yeah, I gotta try out the slack key next time. I think I
yeah.
tried it in standard tuning.
Mhm.
I think you had what
And
you have
now
like two guitars, two
I,
Kamakis.
it's kind of, yeah. My addiction has grown since then, but I think I have 5 or 6 now.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and then slightly different sizes too. So Kamaka was also, making slightly different sized guitars. The necks are also different. Have deep V necks. Some are shallow V. Some are more rounded. So there's some very interesting things in terms of construction that was also happening. But the tone of these instruments are world class. I mean, I would put those guitars against the best guitars out there. I mean, they're that good. They're
Wow.
that good. And I haven't had anyone come in where they said, this is off or this is weird. I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, these things were made in the teens, but they stand tall with the best guitars even today. So
Oh,
it's really
and it's aged too, so it must like have this really
oh yeah,
nice vintage koa sound to it.
absolutely. I mean, there's nothing like an aged dry koa sound that is world. That is special. It really is special. Yeah.
Oh man, 6 guitars. Yeah, I remember you were saying like, oh, this is not even like a lot of my stuff. I think we were in a smaller studio or something, and you said, oh,
It
this is
was
just some of
tiny.
my
When
stuff.
Yeah, when you first came in, that was only half the space, and then since then, we've doubled that space, and that's kind of where we're at right now. But it's still tight in there, but we make it work. And so, yeah, if you get down here, give me a holler beforehand.
Oh, for sure.
Nice.
I gotta check out those Kamaka guitars. And as for Kamaka, do you have any like interesting? I guess like, did they have any one-off models or just a unique model that you barely see these days? Maybe like a
There are
pineapple.
several. Yeah, I mean, there are some that were models. For example, the painted pineapple. I've had several of those pass through. That's an iconic instrument where the front is painted, and then the next series they painted the backs
Ah,
only. Then they switched out to no painting, and they switched out to decals. So I have those. They also have shell inlaid pineapples, regular shell, figure 8 instruments, standard shape. But there are a couple I've seen over the years, these one-offs, and some I have, and some of my friends have as well. Just beautiful, and that name Kamaka is synonymous with ukulele, and it's a wonderful family, wonderful company. They actually have a really cool connection with the forefathers of the ukulele, right? There are three, as you might know. In 1879, you have Augusto Diaz, Manuel Nunez, and then also Jose Espiritu Santo. And all three of them came on the Ravenscraig in 1879, August 23rd, I believe. But they
Dang.
were, at that time, if you think about it, Nunez, he's like 36 years old. Diaz, I think he's 37. Santos, the youngest, he's 28. When he gets here, they all had to work in the plantation fields on the neighbor islands first. Diaz actually finishes his contract earlier than what he was actually contracted for. But all three of them made their way to Honolulu in the Chinatown area and set up shop there. Augusto Diaz actually shows up first in the Honolulu Directory in 1884 as creating his business. Manuel Nunez shows up the year after that, 1885, and then 1886, Santo shows up in the directory. Now, nobody knows who actually built the first ukulele, but as far as the directory is concerned, Diaz created his business and registered at least first. But nobody goes into business without knowing how to do something first. So it's likely that prior to start of establishing their businesses, that they were already familiar with building the instruments, and so there are likely some pieces that predate that time
That's
period.
fascinating.
Yeah, but it's kind of crazy too, is if you think about that time, right? Like 1879, the Ravenscraig comes over. That was actually the second large wave of Portuguese from Madeira to come over, but to me, what's fascinating too is if you take a look at the ship's log, what's on the ship it tells you a lot about what's happening in Hawaii at that time. For example, in addition to things like plates and so forth that were coming from Madeira and Portugal that were popular with the Portuguese that had already immigrated over. So commodities and goods that were being sold. There was wine and all kind, alcohol, and but there's also just daily types of things that you would use, furniture and chairs and all of these things. But the few things that really stood out too, for example, during that time period, there were about 600 plus or so of these steel beams that were coming over, and we don't know if those were specifically used for this purpose, but we do know that right at that time period, the rail system for sugarcane was being developed here. So railroad was being created to haul cane and other goods and commodities, back and forth into the harbor areas, and so to transport that to the ships and then bring that over. And the Ravenscraig had quite a few pieces of steel that were coming over. It could have been used for other things as well. It doesn't tell us beyond that, but taking a look at the ship's log, in addition to other things that were coming over, does give you a snapshot of what life would have been like during that time period, and where a lot of time and effort was being spent as well. Yeah.
Oh man, just like this brings me back to this paper I wrote back in high school. I haven't thought about it since then, but yeah, it was just so fascinating learning the origins of them coming over and kind of introducing the ukulele. But do you know when did the Kamakas meet them back in the day?
Yeah, so that's a great question.
And I should know this, but I'm just gonna ask it.
Yeah, no. Santu, they all came in 1879, but Santu, he passes away in 1905, right? And then Diaz passes away in 1911. Kamaka actually started in, and you should know this one, when?
I know this is 1916.
16, right?
Yeah, better get that one.
Put you on the spot, huh? So yeah, they started in 1916. Now they did have a relationship, and they learned, from Manuel Nunez. Manuel Nunez actually was the longest of the three builders, established builder. He had built, for like 43 years or something like that, somewhere around there. Well, no, he was in Hawaii for 43 years, but he
Oh,
had he
okay.
had he had built for like 32 years, I think it was. And so anyway, during that time, Manu Nunes was a very successful businessman too. He worked with CF Marketing Company to help also create some Hawaiian guitars under his label.
Mm.
They are clearly made at the Martin factory, but they bear the Manu Nunes name. There are also, on the West Coast in particular, there are establishments that solely represent Manu Nunes' ukulele. So he was very successful. And there are ship's logs that show him traveling by ship, right, between Honolulu and the West Coast as well, as he's doing his business ventures. But he is the one that is attributed with working with the Kamakas to have them learn some of the techniques for ukulele building, to my knowledge.
Dang, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah,
Just how it connects together. Oh, okay, interesting. And they
yeah.
just kind
I
of.
have some examples here if you wanted to see.
Oh
Um,
yes, please. I
I
think
can
we all
show you
do.
a few. Actually, I'll start with this far end one here. This is actually not an ukulele, but let me just show you this. This is made in Portugal. It's called a rajao or rajao. And you see it has 5 strings, and this is the size of a tenor. And you'll see that the headstock has a fifth peg here. So it's
Mm.
5 courses, right? So it's not like a 5-string ukulele. This is where the ukulele gets its reentrant GCEA tuning. So the GCEA reentrant tuning comes from this instrument, and this top string is a D.
Oh,
So it's
okay.
D, G, C, E, A. And this is known
Oh,
as a rajao. This is the mother instrument to the ukulele. And Brazilian rosewood, right? So during this time period, Brazilian rosewood or Brazil was uh, occupied or conquered by the Portuguese earlier on. So Madeira was on the trade route. And so materials were, although they have woods that are indigenous to Madeira as well, there are also woods that were being brought and traded and sold that were passing through Madeira. Brazilian rosewood was one of them. That's why you see some of these early instruments that have that. This one here is the father instrument to the ukulele. It looks like a soprano size, but this is not an ukulele. It's also made in Madeira. These last two instruments, somewhere around 1870 to 1890, probably somewhere around there. But this one is super clean. This is also Brazilian, and it has a
oh,
spruce or a softwood top here. And you can see that they have inlay right there. This little flower is inlaid, and this is what they call overlay. It sits on top of the soundboard. So if you run your finger on it, it's not inlaid in.
oh,
But this
interesting.
instrument is the size of a soprano ukulele, similar scale and so forth, but the tuning is an alternate tuning. It's DGBD tuning. So
DGBD.
DGBD is
Oh,
the tuning. And they basically took the size of this instrument, and then they took the tuning of the first 4 strings of the rajao, and then eventually they simplified the instrument. But that's kind of the development of the instrument as it was being created.
dang. And what is this one called? The father instrument?
This one is called the Machete Bravo.
Oh, is
Yeah.
that's the prototype, right, to the ukulele? If I'm not.
Yeah, well, kind of. I mean, this the one of two parent instruments, right? So that the larger one is one of the parent instruments. That's the mother instrument to the ukulele. This is the father instrument to the ukulele, at
Okay.
least attributed. And these are both Portuguese instruments made in Madeira prior to the ukulele being created, as it may be here. From there, actually, this is interesting too. You'll notice that these backs tend to be more flat, right?
Yeah. Flat.
And the thicknesses tend to be a little bit thinner on these instruments, more uniform. And basically, what's happening here, um, this is the oldest known. This is an ukulele, but this is the earliest known example of an ukulele in existence, at least This instrument was on display in Honolulu Academy of Arts here on Oahu. In 1941, about 6 months before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, this instrument was on display there as being the oldest known example of an ukulele in existence. It also has very similar features to the Machete that we just looked at, right? It's also Brazilian back and sides, has a similar porous soundboard. But if you look closely, the neck on this instrument is actually koa. So we know that this instrument was made here. Now, and it still bears the tag from the museum. It's still on there since 1941. So it's pretty cool. But this is the earliest known example of an ukulele that we're aware of, and it seems to predate labels and so forth too.
Wow.
But you can see a lot of the similar parallels. Right? Notice that there's a fingerboard, right? Bridge pins.
Yeah.
And then alternate wood, right? Brazilian, for example, spruce top. Shortly thereafter, you will see the use of koa. So this is an instrument that was made around 1884, and this one is a spruce or a softwood top. It could be a fir top or a spruce top, but it's also got koa back inside and a koa neck, right? And so, but you'll notice that there's still a fingerboard and bridge pins.
Mm.
So there's some consistency here with what the parent instruments have. And this one, you'll see another developmental change. Now you'll notice this is Manuel Nunez. This is about 10 years later, roughly about 1895. No fingerboard, no bridge pins, right? All koa, so no softwood on the top. This is an all koa instrument. Now, a few things, that kind of come to my mind is that I think that some of the reasons why the instrument was changing, I think there are several reasons, and I don't know definitively, but I think that from a business perspective, nobody really knows what these instruments are, right? In Hawaii. So people don't know what these instruments are. There really isn't, the term ukulele doesn't really show up in any sort of advertisement or anything until 1898. So from the time that these guys got here in 1879, and then when they started establishing their companies, 1884, 85, 86, you don't find any sort of record printed, at least, that talks about the ukulele, the term ukulele. Now the instrument we know existed, but we don't know exactly when or how frequent the terms were being used. And then we see that this shows up in print at a much later time. So basically, you point that out because people like this instrument and they're playing it, but they also don't know how to play it per se, right? They're learning how to play it. Can you imagine, people have to learn how to play the instrument. So, and as you know, you don't typically learn up here. You learn here first.
Yeah, and there's no music to listen to. Like they you can't bring records. So
yeah, exactly. So on a builder's perspective, you kind of wonder the necessity to have frets beyond the 12th fret. There isn't really people like yourself that would play way up here early on.
That's you're right. That is, now I'm very curious. Like, how was this supposed to be playing back then? Because a lot of probably back then they were strumming into like the 1st to 3rd fret region, but there must be a purpose if there's that many frets.
Right. So the parent instruments, because those instruments were, I have friends that have some instruments that date back as far as early 1800s, the Machete, for example. And so those instruments are around for a long time, which means that people are playing them, are accustomed to playing them, and you have people of different skill levels that are also playing them. Whereas the ukulele, as it's first being introduced, people don't really know what that instrument is down here in Hawaii. And so the need to play up here, at least in the beginning, maybe was not apparent. But also, I think in addition to that, on the not only on the player side but on the builder side, I think it's also a business decision for the builders like Diaz, Nunez, and Santu. If you could save time building instruments and save materials, for example, no fretboard, it means you save wood and it's faster to build. No bridge pins, but just slotting this in here would mean quicker. It basically means you would be able to reduce cost and you would also be able to increase profits. And so from a business perspective, there's something interesting that's also happening in terms of kind of the influences on the early development of the ukulele, both from the business perspective, also from the player's perspective. And a third one too is if you think about who's here, nowadays, like Andrew, if you wanted to learn a little bit about ukulele construction, you have two amongst others, amazing builders right on your island, right?
Yeah.
You could knock on Steve's door or Eric's door, and there are others on that island too as well. You could just go and ask questions. But for this time period, Santo, Diaz, and Nunez, they're really, the only ones, at least to our knowledge, that we're aware of, that are familiar with building the instruments. And so you see some similarities showing up on some of these instruments because they're friends too. These, sure, they're selling instruments and they're kind of competitors to a certain degree, but they also came over on the same ship. 12, they came over on the same ship and they knew each other. And actually, I believe it was Diaz and Santa that also shared workshop space. I think that's what it was, as well. And so there's a lot to be said, about what's happening during that time in terms of construction. But they don't have the benefit of asking anybody else except for those three people. And what's interesting is in Lutheran in general, I think people, and this is not specific to ukulele builders, but when you learn about building instruments and so forth, you look at other people's work, right? You're building violins or you're building guitars. You learn a lot of times from someone else. You might improve on it or make things your own. And nowadays people would learn from YouTube or reading books and so forth. But from that time period, you were an apprentice. You learned at someone's shop and you experimented and you kind of worked on that. Keep in mind that these guys, traveled thousands of miles from Madeira, and all of the traditions in building instruments are rooted in the European tradition. So when they come here to Hawaii, geographically, they're thousands of miles away from the influence or the restrictions, as it might be, of building techniques from builders in Europe. So there's no builder breathing down their neck saying, "Hey, your instrument is missing a fretboard. Hey, you should do it this way. Hey, you should do it that way." And that's why we see in the earliest seasons, I didn't bring them all today, but you can see the body sizes begin to change. The backs begin to get arched. The upper and lower bouts get bigger, and then they go smaller. Some of them are tiny, and then they go bigger. So there's all kinds of experimentation going on during that time period because they have the flexibility to do that. Yeah.
I feel like I just had a history lesson. Thank you.
No, sorry.
No,
it
was
passionate
good
about this stuff.
No, that's good, and I love your passion for it, and I had a blast learning about it, and I had no idea there was that mother instrument. I knew about the machete. That's what I remember writing the paper about, but I had no idea it had two influences for the very first ukulele. And just everybody, that was the very first ukulele, and just unbelievable that you have it, Shawn.
And we are recording all of these. So I genuinely believe in the spirit of these instruments is that they not really be collected. I mean, we owe a lot to the collectors. Without collectors, we would never have these instruments to begin with. But I genuinely feel that the builder built these instruments to play. And so that's why under certain types of circumstances, and we can't do it with everybody, I do bring them out, we record them for the benefit of the general public to hear what these instruments sound like. From different musicians and so forth. So all of those recordings are on the webpage under the museum tab.
Yeah, check out Ukulele Friend, everybody. Just
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know how many ukuleles. It must be hundreds. It's just
Oh,
so
there's
cool
a
to.
lot of craziness in there. Yeah. I got to
Um,
tame it back a little bit.
no, don't. I'm just curious. Is there like I, I I know that we're running short on time. I know you got to go soon, but I'm just curious. Is there a certain wood combination that sticks out to you since you've been around so many? Because that's something I've been getting into. Is because when I was younger, growing up, I was like koa koa. I've been just playing koa, and recently I have this fascination of like maybe cedar, maybe I love spruce rosewood. I'm
Mhm.
just getting introduced to these different tone woods. But personally, since you've been around some of the best ukuleles, is there a
Mhm.
combination that really stands out to you?
I mean, I think I certainly have my favorites, and koa is definitely one of them too. There's something magical about a
Yeah.
koa ukulele, and for me, it's connection to the historical ones as well. But I think that what I've kind of learned over the years is that the more I learn from all of these amazing builders about woods and about bracing patterns and even things like what wood you use on the neck, what type of finish, all of these things impact the sound of the instrument. So it's not only the soundboard and the back and sides and the bracing, right? There's so much more, which includes thicknesses and for some builders, they brace the sides and so there's all kinds of considerations. And when it comes to wood, what I learned is that never discount certain woods. For example, I've had so many pre-owned instruments come through. And sometimes a pre-owned instrument, in my opinion, as long as it's been cared for, is actually better than a new instrument because it's already open. And
Aged.
it oftentimes, yeah, and it doesn't have to be 140 years old, right? It could be just a few years old. But if it was cared for well, that instrument oftentimes, I mean, sounds phenomenal, and so much more open than when it was closed. Yeah, when it was brand new.
That's
But
true.
what I did learn through these builders is that if you there's woods and there's woods and instruments that came in, I personally would have never ordered an instrument with those woods on. But having played it after it was built and after a year or two that it's opened up has totally changed my mind about woods. I'm not as concerned about woods now as I'm concerned about who builds it. Who
Ah,
builds it is first.
that's true.
Woods and everything else is secondary. Yeah. And that's always the formula, for me, because as although I do have my favorites in woods, people and some of these builders have proven me wrong because they sound so amazing with woods I would have otherwise never thought would have sounded that way. I had an example. To give you an example, I had a baritone from Kennard that came in a few years ago, that just was killer. And it was maple back and sides with a spruce top, which is not a combination I would typically think about.
Yeah.
Uh, might be bright or whatnot,
Right.
even the baritone. But this thing was as mellow and as warm as could be. And that's just one example. Joji is another one. He built this one instrument, I think, of several came through. It was Pernambuco, which is a phenomenal. That's woods that you use for the violin bow, right? And I had this instrument pass through a few years back too, and that instrument was absolutely amazing. Now I would have not ordered one uh, uh, without having come across this instrument, but now that I have heard it, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's something to be said about all of these. And those are just two of the many examples of just remarkable woods that are out there. But the builders are number one first.
Build it. I agree with you, and I guess I like to encourage more I guess ukulele players that experiment with different woods because you'll hear certain tones that fit certain songs, and be open-minded because like I feel like my world has opened up since I started welcoming like maple, mango. I want a cedar ukulele. That's next on my list because I don't have one. It's like one of the woods that I'm missing. But
Mhm.
yeah, you'll have fun with it, and it's a great hobby.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting too with those woods is even for myself, I kind of have to remind myself that even though I have this preconception of what in certain woods will sound like, that ultimately it's in the hands of the builder first. And time and time again, the more I study about this and I learn from builders, the more I realize I need to let go of the stigma that I have of a instrument sounding a certain way with certain woods. The more I can let go of that and just listen to the instrument and trust in the skill of the builder, the more you will be surprised.
Yeah.
Because those instruments that they're making nowadays are really remarkable instruments. Yeah.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And about the maple, like I thought maple was a really like it would be too bright, but I
Mhm.
played one recently and I was like, dang, I'm impressed. Everyone's getting better at their craft, and yeah,
Mhm.
don't knock a wood until you try it.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember this one too, and it's not very popular in ukuleles at least. But Linen of Laimana Ukuleles, he made me a few years back of Paduk, which is very
Oh,
popular wood in guitars, and it's not very. I mean, it looks kind of plain. It's not, it has some orange tinges and it gets dark over time and so forth. But as that wood is a phenomenal wood, for back and sides. But once again, that education came from another luthier friend, along with many others and many other discussions over the years about a whole host of different types of woods and why the instruments sound the way that they do. Um, Lots of education, but lots of fun.
nice. You're very lucky to have the mentors that you have, and so you can educate all of us.
I consider myself fortunate. Yeah, I consider myself fortunate to know guys like you too.
Oh man. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, I know people are gonna enjoy this episode. Thanks again, Sean, for taking time out of your busy day to talk story with us. And yeah, me and my dad hope to make it over to Wahoo soon, and we'll come play some of your Kamaki
absolutely,
guitars,
absolutely.
man.
Oh yeah, man. Keep in touch. Keep in touch. Drop me a line anytime.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sean.
All right. Aloha.
Aloha.